By summer 1958, Palermo and Appalachin were told in two accents. In Washington, a federal narcotics agent named Martin Pera laid out the signal. Joe Bonanno and Carmine Galante flew to Sicily, met Santo Sorge, Lucky Luciano's lieutenant, and came home just in time for the Hilltop Barbecue in upstate New York. Palermo was the policy meeting. Appalachin was the roll call. Pera gave the senators the playbook Bonano had followed for years. Get a front, pour in illicit cash, crush rivals under the cover of business. After Capone, the smart ones learned taxes and titles beat Tommy guns. So, the families bought what they needed: dress houses, trucking firms, labor consultancies, and used union levers to steer freight and kill strikes on command. Pera pointed to Frank Scalise in the Bronx, partner in a plaster company, and at the same time one of the country's biggest heroin importers, with a line to Luciano. Letters from Scalise to Nino Torres, read into the record, showed the inner court. Fraternal vows, Mafia trials, discipline without headlines. For Bonano, the fronts weren't camouflage. They were engines. His old B&D coat company in Brooklyn sat inside a pipeline built by friends and kin. John Bonventre on contracting, Natale Evola moving deliveries and pressing the shoulder pad association, Joseph Riccobono with dress labels that looked legitimate on paper and answered to men who weren't. On the other end of the wire, Galante, Bonanno's hammer, tied the labor play to narcotics supply. Palermo proved the international board still moved on a nod from exile. Appalachin showed who would carry it out in the States. A year to the day after the raid, November 14, 1958, the FBI knocked in Tucson. They took Bonano on a material witness warrant out of Brooklyn. The charge wasn't murder or dope. It was defiance. He'd ignored a grand jury subpoena tied to the Appalachin fallout. The Bureau said they'd been looking for him for months. Stakeouts came up dry. People figured he'd slipped to Cuba or Italy. Instead, he opened the door on East Elm Street like a man answering for a delivery. Tucson wasn't an accident. Years earlier, Bonano moved his family west for his son's health and found a new base that fit his instincts. Quiet streets, good lawyers, a Detroit transplant named Pete Licavoli down the road, and a flight schedule that pointed everywhere he needed. When immigration tried to push him out in 1955, the case fizzled. He stayed. Tall, careful, well-tailored. He looked like a banker and lived like a rancher. But every so often his name surfaced where the money flowed: garment orders upstate, trucks on the Brooklyn docks, a Newark motel where men gathered before heading north. Back in New York, the Appalachin story aged into farce and punishment at the same time. A Buffalo civic leader swore his Cadillac's wet brakes had steered him to Joseph Barbara's doorstep. Another man said he'd come to fix the plumbing. A fishmonger claimed he'd dropped by to sell 3 porgies and a mackerel, and, seeing troopers, doubled back to confirm the order. The police had the grocery slips to prove the scale: 200 pounds of steak, a whole ham, 20 pounds of veal, and the photographs of silk suits caked with mud to prove the panic. The paper trail was cleaner. Lists showed 60-plus delegates, 8 reputed Mafia capos among them, racking up 153 arrests and 74 convictions across homicide, gambling, liquor, and narcotics. Names that echoed through Bonanno's orbit kept reappearing. Big John Ormento, already indicted with Galante in a multi-million-dollar heroin case. Evola, Riccobono, Paul Castellano. Agents stitched it together with toll records and union rosters. Reuters investigators mapped the non-union Pittston garment shops feeding New York racks. Treasury widened a coast-to-coast liquor probe and quietly logged 30 Appalachin guests, Bonanno included. In committee rooms, John McClellan warned that if proof was needed to drive out the crooks, these hearings would supply it. Robert Kennedy said Appalachin would be the spine, and labor rackets from Chicago to Miami the limbs. The penalties came in pieces. Civil jail terms for silence, liquor licenses revoked, pistol permits pulled, tax charges filed, deportation proceedings open. A dozen men handed in their guns. 15 disappeared outright. Barbara's 58-acre estate went up for sale, the host now a sick man who wouldn't answer his door. The hill was quiet, but the wires it exposed were still hot. Through it all, Bonano kept his profile the way he liked it. Measured. Let others explain wet breaks and fish orders. He had Palermo for strategy, Brooklyn for muscle, and Tucson for air, family, and distance. When the senators talked about the international character of the Mafia, they were describing his map. When agents traced front companies that could flip a grievance or wash a shipment, they were describing his method. And when the FBI finally rang his bell in Arizona, they weren't ending his story. They were marking the moment the man in the shadows had to step into the light and keep walking. By the first anniversary of Appalachin, the circle tightened on Joe Bonano. The FBI came to his Tucson house the morning of November 14, 1958, and took him in on a material witness warrant out of Brooklyn. No body, no drugs, no hijack, just a subpoena. He'd ignored back in March. He posted $75,000 bond, huge money for Tucson, walked out and told reporters the same line he used for everything that wasn't their business. "I don't know what it's all about." Washington had already set the tone. Federal narcotics agent Martin Pera told the Senate Rackets Committee that just before Appalachin, Bonano and Carmine Galante met in Palermo with Santos Sorge, Lucky Luciano's man in Italy. The Bureau read it as coordination, not coincidence. Palermo for the international handshake, Appalachin for the American rollout. Pera sketched the model Bonanno long preferred. Buy fronts, pour illicit money through them, and use the veneer of business to crush the competition. Garment houses, trucking outfits, labor relations firms. He put Frank Scalise in the frame as the prototype. Partner in a plaster company, and still importing heroin with a line to Luciano. Letters about Mafia trials and discipline to prove the rules traveled with the money. The one-year write-ups of Appalachin re-ran the greatest hits, wet breaks, fish orders, plumbing emergencies, excuses drowned out by the facts. 60 men, 8 reputed Mafia bosses, 153 arrests, and 74 convictions among them. Names that already orbited Bonanno, Galante, Ormento, Evola, Riccobono, Castellano, showed up again, now tied to narcotics and union angles. Civil contempt bids jailed the stubborn ones. Liquor licenses vanished. Pistol permits were pulled. Some men ran, others sat for depositions and said nothing. Joseph Barbara's hilltop estate went quiet and then went up for sale. The hill was empty. The wires it exposed weren't. Back in Arizona, the arrest read simple. The grand jury in Brooklyn wanted Bonanno to talk about transfers of business and about who ordered what after Anastasia got hit. His lawyer said he probably didn't even know Barbara. Same lawyer said the Italy trip everyone kept mentioning was to visit his mother's grave. The FBI didn't argue in public. They just moved him like a chess piece. 2 weeks later, December. 4. Justice cancelled the Brooklyn subpoena and pushed Bonanno to a Los Angeles grand jury on January 29. The reason was tactical. The feds wanted nothing to do with the New York State Crime Commission's habit of granting immunity. If Albany touched a witness, a federal case might get contaminated. So, they changed venues and kept him in their lane. L.A. wasn't just a room change. The Attorney General had launched a 4-city push, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Miami, to coordinate intelligence on the 100 top hoodlums. The Los Angeles panel would look at syndicate gambling, Mafia influence, even 2 recent gangland murders. Tony Mirabile in San Diego, and Gus Greenbaum in Phoenix. The witness list showed how far Bonanno's shadow reached from Tucson. His son Salvatore, Bill, Bonanno, got a subpoena. So did Victor Tronolone, an accountant tied to Pete Licavoli, and Joseph S. Augello, a Tucson real estate man. The idea was to map the dry front to the wet money, coast to coast. The pressure bled into the margins. In Los Angeles, a domestic mess on Califia Street got booked as a bricklayer, shoving his way into a Joseph Bonanno home and snatching his ex-wife at gunpoint. Tabloid noise with a dangerous last name attached. In Tucson, the old immigration scrape, 1953 to 55, got reheated in headlines. The illegal entry in 1924 via Cuba, the legal re-entry from Canada in 1938, naturalized in 1945, the government's exhibit hinting at a grand council, reputable locals swearing he was a solid citizen, and a judge tossing the denaturalization case. Bonanno smiled for the camera with his lawyers and kept his mouth shut. Meanwhile, the narrative out of Washington stayed steady. Pera's Palermo note, Bonanno and Galante with Sorga, wasn't gossip. It explained how the parts fit. Overseas supply and sanction. Stateside distribution under cover of legitimate business. Union levers to move trucks and settle strikes. Front money laundered into profit. And when the heat came, send the principals west, shift forums, and stall. On paper, Joe Bonanno was a retired coat manufacturer who once picked up a Brooklyn pistol permit and ran a club on Metropolitan Avenue. In practice, by late 1958, he was the man the Senate called very significant to an international syndicate. The man the FBI found at 1847 East Elm Street in Tucson. The man federal prosecutors rerouted across the map to keep him out of Albany's immunity net. And the man whose family, friends, and accountants got tugged in behind him. He still talked like a neighbor, no comment and no story, but the government no longer needed his words. They had his travel, his phones, his fronts, and now his bond receipt. Palermo had been the signal. Appalachin was the echo. The subpoenas were the music that played in between. Winter 1959 turned Appalachin from a spectacle into a system. Subpoenas stacked up, rooms filled, and the government started pulling on every thread that ran through Joe Bonanno. On January 20th, Los Angeles opened with the soft touch, Salvatore. Bill Bonanno, early 20s, walked into a special federal grand jury. The line from justice was careful witnesses weren't targets. They were people who may have observed occurrences. Same day, Dr. Joseph DeSimone, brother of Frank DeSimone who'd shown his face at Appalachin, took a seat. The message was clear. If they couldn't drag the bosses, they'd draft the family. Next day, papers made it plainer. Bill Bonanno had testified. Dunn, the special assistant to the Attorney General, repeated the civics lesson. The real subjects rarely appear. The fifth keeps them away. But the circle was obvious. Bonanno's son, DeSimone's brother, blood and business, in the same hallway. On January 29th, Joe himself came through. Cameras caught him in the corridor, and he gave them one line. Keep yourself in good health and good spirits. Inside, he said whatever he said. Outside, the witness list told the story. Onofrio Sciortino, out of San Francisco. Angelo Massagli. William Lippin. Joe Benfatti. All roads were being checked, trucking, casino, narcotics, and every road that mattered had crossed Joe's. Tucson, the place he'd chosen for quiet, kept tugging him back into print. On February 13th, a big subdivision play surfaced, Chessin Construction, moving to build 1,000+ homes east of Kolb Road. Deeds showed Joe Bonanno had owned a 1/5 interest in 200 acres, sold through escrow. The developer said he hadn't known Joe was in the chain. That was the point. Bonanno invested like a neighbor and positioned like a boss. Los Angeles kept rolling, witnesses. March 11th, Victor Coletti, 6th Tucsonan, testified, alongside Simone Scozzari from L.A. and Frank Vence from Pueblo. Coletti's brother James had been at Appalachin, same as Scozzari. 2 days later, a 7th Tucson name, William J. Weaver, a bookkeeper, took the stand. He'd done personal taxes for Anthony Telesco, Tucson builder, another name called earlier. Also up, Nina Dionisio from Pueblo, Joe Civello from Dallas, Michele Abati from Oroville. Officials said many had no idea their associates were mobbed up. Maybe. But the web was intact. Books, land, phones, freight. Then came the federal hammer. On May 21, 1959, after a year of quiet spadework, 27 Appalachin delegates were indicted for conspiracy to obstruct justice. 5 years and $10,000 a head, if convicted. The list read like an index to Joe's world. Joseph Bonanno, Russell Bufalino, Paul Castellano, Joseph Civello, Frank Cucchiara, Natale Evola, Michelle Miranda, John C. Montana, Big John Ormento, Carmine Lombardozzi, Simone Scozzari, and more. Profaci, Magliocco, and Pasquale Turrigiano picked up perjury counts on top. Barbara himself was named a co-conspirator, not a defendant. 7 delegates were already sitting in civil jail for clamming up in state proceedings. More would follow. The government had stopped chasing motives and started punishing silence. To nail down the memory, the papers reprinted the raid as Sergeant Edgar Croswell told it. The roadblock on the dead end, the dozen men sprinting into the rain-soaked field, the mud-caked suits in the Vestal substation as records rolled in over teletype. The careful frisk. The cash counted out by the stack. Scozzari, with $602 cash and an $8,445 cashier's check in his pocket and a claim of unemployed for 20 years. The job titles scrubbed down to nothing. Transportation work, retired, clerk. The fairy tales about walking to the Pennsylvania station, 70 miles away. Croswell didn't need confessions. He had bodies, cars, money, and a room full of men who looked like they'd never been that quiet in their lives. Through all of it, Bonano held the same posture, present but distant. He let Bill face questions, let lawyers argue bonds, $75,000 in Tucson, let developers say they never knew his name was on the deed. He took the plane to L.A. when the feds moved the target away from New York's immunity trap. He said nothing that could be quoted twice, but the outline didn't need his voice. Palermo to Appalachin, garment fronts to union levers, Tucson acreage to escrow receipts, family to witnesses. When the Justice Department redrew the map, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Miami, Bonano was already on all 4 corners. The grand juries gave the hunt a schedule, the indictments gave it teeth, and the man who preferred shadows kept moving, quiet, composed, and very much in the light. Summer 1959. The masks came off. Papers printed the roll of 60 who'd stood in Joseph Barbara's mud 2 years earlier. Bosses, chauffeurs, dressmakers, consultants, and cash. In the middle of the roster sat Joe Bonano of Brooklyn and Tucson. The entry, written like a resume, with a record. Funeral home, garment company, laundry, import-export, olive oil, cheese, and a file that once said grand larceny, concealed weapon, conspiracy, wage-hour rap. An old note even claimed he'd sold machine guns to Capone's crew. Legit businesses on one line, heat on the next. That was Joe's balance sheet. The list wasn't gossip, it was context. It showed how Appalachin had drawn from California, Florida, Texas, Cuba, Italy. How garment trucking, vending, union halls, liquor, and narcotics were bolts in the same chassis. Unions sat next to jukebox routes. Labor relations firms shared the page with dope indictments. Names that orbited Bonano kept reappearing. Bon Ventre, family and contracts, Evola, garment delivery and a shoulder pad association, Ricobono, dress labels, Castellano, chauffeuring Gambino that day and climbing fast, Aumento, narcotics muscle, Galante, the fist, now a fugitive. If you wanted to see how one man stayed indispensable without raising his voice, the roll call did the work. While the government stacked witnesses on both coasts, Tucson put Bonano back on the real estate page. Deeds came out of escrow, a 1/5 stake Joe had held in 200 acres east of Kolb Road, sold through a broker to a home builder who said he didn't know Joe was in the chain. That was the point. Bonano bought quiet. Desert land, clean titles, taxmen who dealt in numbers, not names. Then Washington stopped charting and started charging. May 21st, 1959, a federal grand jury unsealed conspiracy to obstruct justice indictments against 27 Appalachin delegates. The case didn't ask what the meeting was for. It asked what the men did afterward. False, fictitious, and evasive testimony, clamming up in rooms where silence was a crime, not a code. Alongside the conspiracy counts sat perjury for Profaci, Magliocco, and Pasquale Turigiano. Barbara himself was named as a co-conspirator. The penalty, up to 5 years and $10,000 per man. The build-up played like a dress rehearsal for Judgment Day. Reporters reprinted Sergeant Edgar Croswell's roadblock, the Cadillacs stacked at a dead end, the dozen men sprinting for a black line of trees, the Vestal substation where suits dried and cash got counted. Simone Scozzari offered $602 cash and an $8,445 cashier's check out of his pocket and called himself unemployed for 20 years. Most gave job titles that wouldn't fill a business card. Transportation work, retired, clerk. They emptied their pockets, not their mouths. October 26, 1959, the federal trial finally prepped to open in New York. Judge Irving R. Kaufman on the bench, Milton Wessel for the government, an 800-person jury pool outside. Then the headline that fit Bonanno's lifelong timing. Heart attack in Brooklyn, taken to St. Catherine's, doctor's note in hand. Kaufman severed Joe from the case and pushed his hearing indefinitely. No theatrics, no argument. The government didn't fight the paper. The other 22 filed in, conservative suits and straight faces, and the slow grind began. As predicted, weeks, maybe months. Bonanno's bond receipts told his side of the calendar. $75,000 in Tucson, the day the FBI took him, November 14, 1958. $50,000 set in New York, the day the National Dragnet closed, May 21, 1959. Then dropped to $15,000. In between, subpoenas hopped him from Brooklyn to Los Angeles, away from New York's immunity tangle, and into a national push on the 100 top hoodlums. His son Bill got called. So did his accountants and real estate men. The witnesses read like a ledger, who carried Joe's checks, who signed his escrow, who took his calls. By the time the jury clerks started pronouncing names, the story was simple and hard. Palermo had been the signal. Appalachin was the echo. The indictments were the leverage. And Joe Bonanno, coatmaker on paper, broker in practice, sat exactly where he always aimed to be, just off stage, case severed, bond posted, lawyers talking, heart under observation, still in the center of the map without ever taking the mic. Trial. Without the Don Fall 59, New York put Appalachin on trial. Without Joe Bonanno. He'd flown east, checked into Brooklyn, and, right on cue, collapsed. A court doctor said he had a heart attack. Judge Irving Kaufman severed him from the case and rolled on with 22 defendants. Bonanno slipped back into the shadows he liked best, present in every witness's mouth, absent from the defense table. Inside court, The state's story wasn't poetry. It was mud, cash, and lies. Sergeant Edgar Croswell, the trooper who'd choked off the dead-end lane in '57, told the jury how John C. Montana, Buffalo's polished man of the year, pulled him aside and hinted he could do something if the sergeant let him go. Another government man, Treasury Agent Kenneth T. Brown, walked the panel through the hilltop, a single-file line of suits breaking for the trees. Montana and Antonio Magadino snagged on a barbed wire fence, pants and coats spotted with mud. And a few rows over in the corn, John Bonventre and Joe Bonano. The defense said they'd come to see a sick friend, maybe for a barbecue. A Barbara housekeeper remembered beds slept in the night before, and Montana apologizing for being late because his car broke down. The cops remembered cashier's checks and wads of hundreds in the pockets of men who called themselves clerks and retired. The indictment didn't ask what the meeting decided. It asked what the men did after the raid. False, fictitious and evasive answers to grand juries and investigators. 27 were charged with conspiracy to obstruct justice. Profaci, Magliocco and Turigiano carried perjury on top. In December, the jury came back guilty for the bulk of them, Bufalino, Ostico, Sciandra and 17 more, while Kaufman swatted down a blizzard of defense motions about roadblocks, warrants and prejudicial headlines. Bonano wasn't in that verdict. His file sat on a doctor's note. Arizona moved on him instead. On November 18, 1959, a Phoenix federal grand jury opened his books. Subpoenas hit Tucson, his son Salvatore, Bill, an Eloy cotton man, A.J. Battaglia, real estate brokers David Batavia, Joseph Augello, E.L. Juster, and Donald Millstone. Ledgers, cancelled checks, bankiers itemized. Valley National downtown and university branches. Bank of Flagstaff. In the hallway, Bill played it cool. The Mafia is a fantasy, a monster to sell papers. He called organized crime a cover for local incompetence. Polite, groomed, non-committal. Inside, Battaglia sat morning to afternoon with 1953 ledger sheets. Others did their time and walked. The panel adjourned without an immediate bill, flagged the case for more work, then reconvened after New Year's to grind again. Phoenix cops and county men didn't need sermons. They had a body. January 1960, Louis Sirota, a Tucson real estate dealer who pawled around with mob names, turned up strangled in the trunk of his car. The sheriff called it what it looked like, gangland. He said Sirota had ties to a Teamsters figure and, pointedly, friendship with Joseph Bonano. The county attorney said big-time hoods had moved in and needed to be moved out. Tucson wasn't supposed to read like that. Now it did. While Arizona hauled in accountants, Victor Tronoloni, Anthony Scrivano, and ticked through income tax angles, the New York trial kept unspooling vignettes from the Hill. A fence snag here, a cornfield grab there, mud-caked shoes lined up in the Vestal substation. Croswell's roomful of silent men, money counted, names mumbled, occupations minimized, reappeared as exhibits and testimony, and every few days another reminder: Bonano found in the field, Bonano severed by a heart attack, Bonano's case indefinite. Away from the legal grind, the Bonano house in Tucson looked like any professional family's living room. Christmas 1959, Joseph and Faye announced Catherine's engagement to Gregory Genovese, a dental student out of Tucson High and USC. Friends and clergy raised glasses. Guests talked colleges and careers. It's how Joe always built his cover. Neighbors, escrow, baptisms. That's what made him hard to pin. He could host a betrothal on East Elm Street, while grand juries in New York and Phoenix argued over his ledgers and his pulse. By early 1960, the scorecard read like this. The Appalachin conspiracy trial rolled forward without him. Arizona aimed at his taxes. L.A. kept a standing panel for the 100 top hoodlums, and Tucson now had a homicide with underworld echoes. Bonanno's profile didn't change. He answered reporters with pleasantries, good health and good spirits, and let lawyers, doctors, and witnesses fill the record. He was seen in a cornfield and absent at council table. He was on a deed in escrow and off a docket by doctor's note. He was exactly where he preferred to be, in the story's center, just out of reach. By late 1959, Joe Bonano was exactly where he liked to be, everywhere and nowhere. In New York, the Appalachin case finally went to trial. In Arizona, federal grand juries dug into his books. In the West, cops argued over whether organized crime even existed, while names tied to him kept surfacing in ledgers and subpoenas. And in Tucson, at 1847 East Elm, the Bonano house was busy with engagements, wedding plans, and family pictures. The New York courtroom played out like a slow-motion replay of the raid. State Trooper Edgar Croswell told the jury how Buffalo's John C. Montana, still in his good suit, tried to smooth-talk his way out. Knew important people, could do something if he were let go. A Treasury agent walked the panel through the hilltop, a single-file line of men slipping off the estate. Montana and Antonio Magadino, tangled on a barbed wire fence, pants and coats speckled with mud and burrs, and in the corn, John Bonventre and Joe Bonano. A housekeeper said 4 guest beds were slept in the night before. Montana apologized to the host for being late, blamed a car problem. The official story, barbecue, sick friend, coincidence, didn't match the cash and the travel. Judge Irving Kaufman made the case simple. It wasn't about what was decided. It was about the wall that went up afterward, false, fictitious, and evasive answers to investigators and grand juries. On December 18th, the verdicts landed. In January, he sentenced the bulk of the men hard, 4s and 5s, many with the $10,000 max. Sophisticated, hardened, intelligent criminals, he called them, cloaked in legitimate fronts. One by one they took their numbers. Joe wasn't there to hear it. The night before jury selection, Bonano folded with a heart attack in Brooklyn. A court doctor certified it. Kaufman severed him from the mass trial indefinitely. Same play as before, present in the evidence, absent from the table. He'd already posted $75,000 bond in Tucson the year before, then $50,000 bond in New York, trimmed to $15,000. Now he was convalescing and couldn't be bothered. The case moved on without him. Arizona filled the gap. In November, a Phoenix grand jury opened Bonano's tax file and started calling Tucson. A. J. Chaku, smiling Gus. Battaglia sat with ledgers and cancelled checks. Real estate men, David Batavia, Joseph Augello, E. L. Juster, Donald Milston, brought escrow paper and dates. Subpoenas spelled out what the government wanted. Valley National Bank, downtown and university branches, 53 through 59. Bank of Flagstaff, 56 through 58. One subpoena told accountant Victor Tronalone to produce the 1953 to 58 returns of Salvatore Bill Bonano, the son. In the hallway, Bill gave his own line. The Mafia was a fantasy, a monster for headlines, created to cover up the inefficiency of local authority. He kept it cordial. Inside, the grand jurors kept it quiet, then adjourned with no bill. More to come. January brought more. Witnesses missed dates. The judge told the U.S. attorney to find out if they'd been properly served, and if so, seek orders against them. More Tucson names appeared: Joe Genovese, an Eloy cotton man, insurance and accounting people, Giovanni John DiBella, told to bring 6 years of dealings with Joseph, Fay, and Salvatore. The panel recessed with the Bonano matter continued. When it reconvened, it went right back to work. Insurance man Anthony Scrivano and Tronoloni again. The message was steady. Follow the money, not the myth. On the street, the temperature rose. Tucson got its first real gangland killing. Louis Sirota, a real estate dealer who pawed around with underworld men, found strangled in the trunk of his car. The sheriff called it cold, calculated, and started a list of big-timers to question, Bonano among the friends. The county attorney said what everyone had been dancing around. Big league hoods had moved in. In California, cops argued about Orange County. The sheriff said he saw no organized crime. The DA and a grand jury said otherwise and named the kind of people they were watching: Mickey Cohen, Frank DeSimone, Joseph Bonanno, the Seekers, circling Santa Ana, Anaheim, Fullerton, Buena Park. L. A. P. D's intelligence captain said the area was getting hit because it was growing fast. The Chicago Crime Commission's man compared intelligence work to the Army and Navy. Without it, you'd never see what was right in front of you. While that played out, the family stayed neat. Christmas Eve. 1959, Joe and Faye announced Catherine's engagement to Gregory William Genovese, a dental student out of Tucson High and USC. Summer 1960, the wedding went off at Saints Peter and Paul, Vale, organ, the bishop officiating, Bill as best man, the cousins seated guests. The photos said what Joe always wanted said: neighbors, church, respectability. Tucson saw fine clothes and orchids. New York still saw mud on pant legs in a cornfield. Politically, Joe kept old habits. He'd worked the room since the 30s and enjoyed the table talk. The story that followed him, introduced to FDR as a powerful and dangerous man who could bury enemies in the river, Roosevelt quipping he had Republicans who could use that treatment, fit the way Joe liked to be seen: useful, unflappable, connected. He stayed friendly in the Truman and Eisenhower years, liked Nixon, put distance between himself and the Kennedys, and kept company with men who backed Hoover and the GOP play. In the South, he and Carlos Marcello weren't buying what Kennedy was selling. Others, Gambino, Lucchese, Trafficante, Chicago, tacked toward the rising family in Hyannisport. Joe thought they were making a mistake. Either way, the bill for Appalachin and the Spotlight came due under the Kennedys, and Joe knew he'd have to pay part of it whether he'd voted for them or not. By early 1960, the map had 4 corners, and Joe's thumbprints at each. New York's sentences without him, Los Angeles's standing rackets panels, Phoenix's tax probe, Tucson's first body in a trunk. In between, a daughter's wedding, a son's testimony, escrow deeds moving out of old escrows, and a steady chorus of retired, consultant, just a visit to a sick friend. It was how he'd always done it. Build fronts that worked, keep family tidy, show up everywhere, leave a doctor's note where it counted. When the judge in New York called the convicted men a tale of horrors and said they needed to be segregated from society, he was speaking to the row in front of him. The man the agents found in the Appalachin corn wasn't in that row. He was back in Arizona, convalescing, while the grand juries kept counting years, bank branches, and cancelled checks. Joe Bonanno stayed what he'd trained himself to be, the center of the map, and just out of reach. At the 67th Annual International Association of Chiefs of Police Conference in Washington, Tucson Police Chief Bernard L. Garmere stunned his audience with a blunt warning. America's top organized crime figures had quietly moved into Tucson, Arizona, cloaking themselves in legitimacy and embedding themselves in the city's booming economy. Speaking at a special workshop on organized crime, Garmere pointed directly to the fallout from the notorious Appalachin, New York, mob conclave of 1957, a gathering of 60-plus major underworld figures that police interrupted in mid-meeting. The government called it United States of America versus Joseph Bonanno et al., Garmere said. I have the dubious distinction of having that same Bonanno in my community, Gamia told his fellow chiefs that Joseph Bonano, known as Joe Bananas and widely considered a top mafia boss, was far from alone. Besides Bonano, he said, several members of the Mafia, the ancient Sicilian Black Hand Society, are living in Tucson. The chief described a trio of figures now running from his city. Mr. Big, whom Garmire suggested could be the top Mafia leader in the country. A second man, with powerful influence in the Great Lakes region. A third, known to wield power on the West Coast. All, he said, had mastered the art of hiding in plain sight. These known criminals are capable of donning a facade of respectability and infiltrating into the community, Garmire warned. They become big givers to religious and charitable organizations. Bonano, specifically, was said to control vast real estate holdings and to be involved in several businesses in and around Tucson. Garmire estimated his investments at several $1 million. This economic footprint, he argued, was precisely why men like Bonano had chosen the city. Tucson was growing fast, and ready cash from underworld fortunes could easily be parlayed into lucrative property and legitimate enterprises. The chief emphasized that his department had already assigned special personnel dedicated solely to checking these figures. He also urged interstate cooperation among law enforcement agencies to share intelligence and mount effective prosecutions against organized crime. The warning carried weight. It came just months after federal grand juries in Arizona had subpoenaed Bonano's son Salvatore Bill Bonano and several Tucson businessmen to answer questions about real estate transactions and possible income tax evasion. And it echoed mounting concern among state and federal officials that Tucson's rapid post-war growth had turned it into a strategic haven for national syndicate bosses, a place where they could live quietly, launder money, and manage rackets far from East Coast scrutiny. Garmire's remarks placed Tucson firmly on the organized crime map, transforming what many locals still viewed as a sleepy desert city into, as one reporter later put it, a resort town for America's underworld royalty. By the fall of 1960, the lawmen of America had turned their eyes west, not to Las Vegas or Los Angeles, but to the quiet, sun-soaked streets of Tucson, Arizona. What they saw there wasn't just a growing city. It was a refuge, a new frontier for men whose names had once been whispered in fear on the streets of Brooklyn, Buffalo, and Chicago. And at the center of it all was one man, Joseph Bonano. At the annual gathering of the International Association of Chiefs of Police in Washington, Tucson's chief, Bernard Garmire, stood before his colleagues and dropped a bombshell. The Appalachin case, he said, was officially titled United States of America vs. Joseph Bonano et al., and I have the dubious distinction of having that same Bonano in my community. 3 years earlier, Bonano had slipped out of the shadows of Brooklyn and into the Arizona desert, just as the Mafia's secret conclave in Appalachin, New York, blew the lid off America's organized crime world. That 1957 meeting, 60-odd bosses and lieutenants gathering at the home of mob host Joseph Barbara Sr., ended with police swarming the grounds and mobsters scattering into the woods like startled deer. Many were caught. Some would go to trial. Bonano, always the strategist, denied everything, but his name was stamped on the indictment that followed. Now, Garmire told the assembled chiefs, Bonano had quietly built a new life in Tucson. He's minding his own business, the chief said wryly. But everyone in that room knew what that meant. Bonano wasn't hiding. He was rebuilding. He had sniffed opportunity in Arizona as far back as the Second World War, moving west in 1944, ostensibly for the health of his son Salvatore, known as Bill. What he found was a desert boomtown, ripe for the taking. He's made a killing, Garmire admitted. Bonano invested heavily. Business properties, undeveloped land, and it's multiplied twofold in just 10 years. Bonano didn't just invest, he embedded. He wrapped himself in legitimacy, building a portfolio worth several $1 million. He controlled vast swaths of real estate, ran multiple businesses, and poured money into churches and charities. It wasn't philanthropy, it was strategy. "That's how they get a foothold," Gambino explained. "They put on a facade of respectability, and with their wealth, they gain cooperation from the community." And Bonano wasn't alone. Gambino described 3 men now living quietly in his city. One he called Mr. Big, possibly the top mafia figure in the nation. Another with deep influence across the Great Lakes. A third wielding power on the West Coast. All of them, like Bonano, had learned how to hide in plain sight. They weren't the violent street enforcers of old. They were landowners, businessmen, and benefactors. And they were expanding their reach. Tucson was perfect for them. The weather was good, the city was growing, and the newcomers had cash to burn. In a city flush with new construction and speculation, their money moved like water, buying land, businesses, and influence. They came, in some cases, for their health, as Gambino said with a trace of irony. But they stayed because Tucson was becoming what New York and Chicago could no longer be, a safe haven. The chief admitted he had men assigned solely to watch these figures, Bonano included. But surveillance was difficult. Many mobsters slipped in and out of the city without warning. Others stayed for months, even years, before disappearing back east. Gambino's comments caused a stir, not just for what they revealed about Tucson, but for what they suggested about the future. He opposed the idea of a federal crime commission, fearing it would lead to a national police state. Instead, he called for strengthening the FBI and existing agencies, and for cooperation among states to build the intelligence networks needed to fight men like Bonano. But even as he spoke, the reality on the ground was clear. Bonano had beaten the system. He had slipped through the Appalachin dragnet. He had sidestepped trial after a sudden heart attack. And now, far from the noise of Brooklyn and the bloodletting of Mafia wars, he was building an empire in the desert. One deed, one investment, one handshake at a time. He had turned Tucson into something new, a sanctuary where the old Mafia could grow rich and respectable. And while politicians and police chiefs argued in Washington about how to fight organized crime, Joe Bonano was already 10 steps ahead, smiling behind the wheel of a brand new Cadillac, driving through the city he now called home.